The rule of law is incredibly fragile and precious, that we have to do everything that we can to defend it. We're seeing this now in my own country, where something that we have taken for granted for so long is now under assault.
Can international justice survive in such a world where rules are routinely torn up?
I feel there is another level on which we need to discuss the court, which is what states think that this court is actually for.
You go down the line of prosecutions or your peace process collapses.
Welcome to Dead Men Walking, the new podcast series produced by IFIT in collaboration with Justice Info. In this first episode, we turn our attention to the International Criminal Court, perhaps the most embattled international institution of our time. Is the ICC a bold but overextended experiment, doomed from the start? A flawed yet resilient institution still finding its footing? Or a court trapped in an impossible bind?
Hello and welcome. I am Barney Afako, your host for today's episode. I've spent decades of my life working to end wars in the world, including in my own country, Uganda, which was menaced by the Lord's Resistance Army war. And one of the defining dilemmas we encountered when dealing with that conflict was how to harmonize the demands of international justice with the urgent pursuit of peace for northern Uganda. It is fitting, therefore, that for today's conversation, we turn to the International Criminal Court, the ICC, which has become one of the embattled international institutions of our time. And I'm delighted to welcome three eminent experts in international justice who bring different but complementary vantage points to our conversation today. We have Beth Van Schaack. Beth has had an illustrious career as an attorney and an academic. She's a distinguished fellow of Stanford University's Center for Human Rights and International Justice. Before this, many of you will recall that she served as Ambassador at Large for Global Criminal Justice in the U.S. State Department. And in that capacity, she advised the United States government on issues of responding to war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide.
It's really great to be in conversation with you all. Thank you for having me.
Janet Anderson. Janet is a seasoned journalist specializing in international justice. She has covered international justice issues in Rwanda, Sierra Leone, and Uganda, my country, as well as The Hague, where she's one of Justice Info's correspondents covering the ICC processes. And Janet is a podcaster as well. She's a co-host of a podcast called Asymmetrical Haircuts, which offers a sideways look at international justice, interviewing mainly female experts in their fields.
Thanks very much, Barney. Really looking forward to the discussion.
And we do also have, last but not least, Phil Clark. Phil is a professor of international politics at SOAS University of London, where he teaches and researches conflict and post-conflict issues, including transitional justice, peace building, and reconciliation after mass atrocity. His work covers Rwanda, Uganda, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Burundi as well. Phil's most recent books include Distant Justice, The Impact of the International Criminal Court on African Politics, and we will surely come to some of the themes of that book in a moment. We're also looking forward to his next book on post-genocide inequality and reconciliation in Rwanda.
Thanks very much, Barney. I'm delighted to be in such company to talk about such important issues.
As you can see, our guests are academically and practically well-grounded in issues of international justice, and I can think of no better trio to help us grapple with the challenge facing international justice today. So let's get straight into the discussion. I just saw an online post where somebody said that international law should be relegated to the fiction section of libraries and bookshops. And there seems to be a wide consensus that the ICC is in a perilous place. But each of our presenters today will have a different vantage point on this. I'm going to ask them, do you share this rather bleak assessment of international law on the ICC? And if so, what do you think brought about the crisis that the ICC finds itself in? Is it a structural and inevitable design fault with the ICC? Or are we seeing that there have been some missteps along the way? So what is the status of international law today? Perhaps let me begin with you, Beth, on that.
Well, there's no question that this is a field that feels very much under assault. And I think people teaching this field feel like they've become historians rather than contemporary discussants about current international politics. We've seen major states flouting some of the core norms of international law, not only the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia, but also my own country, the United States, now engaging in warmongering around the world. And so it really does feel like the state of international law is quite at risk. That said, it was interesting that the International Criminal Court has actually in recent times had some very positive developments. It's able to work in certain areas somewhat successfully. So we've seen the first judgment in the Darfur matter that has been long awaited and extremely helpful for victims to see issues of gender persecution written about in the judgment of that case. We've seen the Duterte coming into custody and the confirmation of charges happening. We've seen cooperation with national proceedings, sharing information, helping in support of arrest warrant operations. We've seen the arrest of very senior figures or the arrest warrants issued against very senior figures, even if they're not in custody, their spheres of operation have been significantly curtailed. We've seen new policies released. So, on the one hand, the field is definitely under assault. On the other hand, there was a little bit of a sense that the ICC was gaining a bit of a stride at the same time. So we're having these kind of cross currents in the field at present.
Let me come to you next, Phil. What does it look like for you, very much a person who's been on the ground and seeing the ICC, if you like, from a distance?
I think the ICC, in many respects, has been in a state of crisis right from day one. When it was created in 2002, I, to a certain extent, don't even buy the narrative that it suddenly finds itself in a new period of crisis. I think it's always struggled, and that's certainly been my sense watching the ICC's work, for example, in Central Africa. It's been an institution that in many respects has overpromised what it could do. The first prosecutor, Luis Moreno Ocampo, turned up in Kampala in the midst of an ongoing civil war in northern Uganda, Barney, which you know about better than anybody, and he proclaimed quite loudly that the court would end the conflict in 6 months, which got the kind of derision from Ugandan journalists and Ugandan victims of the conflict that I think it deserved. The court, I think, has been embattled from day one to a certain extent because it's always been very unclear about what it was trying to do. Was this a global institution that would be able to go anywhere in the world and prosecute anybody without fear or favor? Well, it certainly hasn't done that. It's tended to focus very strongly on the allies of the West, and we've only recently seen an exception to that with the arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Gallant in the Israel-Palestine case. But also it's always been tangled up, I think, in this confusion about whether it could end conflict, that it had some profound role in deterring criminality, ending mass violence. And that was the kind of thing that it promised right from the outset and certainly hasn't delivered. So that, I think, creates an enormous amount of disappointment, disillusionment, sometimes even anger on the ground in places like northeastern Congo and northern Uganda. And that was anger and disillusionment that was being expressed in the very early years of the ICC's work. And I've only heard that anger expressed continually right up until the present.
Let me turn to you, Janet, therefore, because you've been following the ICC quite closely based in The Hague. What is the mood like in The Hague? Is it pessimistic about the current situation, or is this court more resilient than it might appear?
It is resilient. I think that Beth has laid out the elements from now that say, yes, they're still going on, they're doing bits and pieces, there's new policies, there's new people in the dock, etc. But the bigger picture on international law is very, very difficult, and the court is not immune to that. And the sanctions that are against many of the individuals in the courts mean that the mood is pessimistic in the long term, because it feels very damned if you do, damned if you don't. If they really do try to take the space of being this universal court doing X, Y, and Z, then welcome to life as a bug that is going to be pushed down to the floor by the Trump authorities. Or you do what Beth has just outlined, which is, let's work in limited areas and try and do our limited things. And then you get the critique, which Phil has partly outlined there, which is, whose tool are you? I mean, who are you doing this for? What is the space that you compromise on and the space that you say, yes, we can do that fully. I just want to go back to one previous point. I want to say thank you very much for describing me as seasoned. I know what that really means. It means old. And it's because it means that I've like all the other
And
people
men's
here,
experienced.
it means experience, but I'm old. I've seen it come, I've seen it go. I was discussing with somebody this morning, shall we say that the court is in crisis? Or should we just say, oh God, the court is again in crisis? And really, it's going to come through in some kind of shape, battered form at the end, because it keeps on happening. I seem to have written this court is in crisis, as Phil suggested, right way through. And I used to write that the Yugoslav tribunal was in a bit of crisis. And then it looked like they managed to arrest a lot of people, and suddenly it turned into a success after having been a crisis. And the Rwanda tribunal got quite a few people, but nobody ever paid much attention to it. It was too far away, but that was often in crisis from those who actually wrote about it. So, yeah, my bigger point is that these courts exist in a world of states, and the states are the problem at the moment, not the court entirely. I don't think the court works incredibly wonderfully, but states, for goodness sake, if you can't obey international law, how do you expect these institutions to work? And states are the problem.
Indeed. And we are repeatedly also hearing, Janet, the expression that the rules-based international order is in crisis. And in some cases, some are arguing it is over. Mark Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister, says that as well.
But Barney, you coming from the global south, did you believe in the rules-based international order? Did it do anything for you?
I think everybody is very cynical about that. But at the same time, I think some other people were invested in international law because they saw international law as a shield and as an equalizer of the relationship between states. But I think even that is, I think, what people may be lamenting alongside the other elements. In any case, do we share that view? It seems people do, that there really isn't a rules-based international order to talk about anymore. And then the question would be, if there isn't, I mean, what kind of world are we looking at the moment? And what kind of international justice? Can international justice survive in such a world where rules are routinely torn up?
Well, let me say one thing. The whole idea of a permanent international criminal court was an incredibly idealistic one. It's quite momentous that there was a moment, a window in time when we were able to actually come together as an international community to draft a multilateral treaty and to have it come into force and to actually build and create a court. It advances the promises of Nuremberg, of individual criminal responsibility, and sending the message that atrocities and aggressive war are entirely inappropriate tools of statecraft and unlawful tactics of war. It strengthens the concept of individual criminal responsibility and may, in some respect, eventually, the idea of international justice contribute to processes of deterrence. And it also responds to the felt need of survivors everywhere for some measure of justice and their emphatic demands for accountability. We are, as a human society, in a phase change. This is like thermodynamics. It's an incredibly unstable period that's very much at the whim of external factors that are swirling around it. And so there will be moments in which the field will expand, and there will be moments when the field will contract. And we're at a massive contraction now. But we've seen this in the past, and we will see it again. And we hope, of course, all of us, that there will be another moment in which we will realize how disastrous the current situation is, and everyone will come back together and recommit to the idea of international law, of international institutions. And so at some level, what we have to do now in this moment is protect where we can, hold the line where we can, advance where we can, particularly in the work that Phil and others have done in strengthening the national justice sectors, and recognize that the rule of law is incredibly fragile and precious, that we have to do everything that we can to defend it. We're seeing this now in my own country, where something that we have taken for granted for so long is now under assault. And we realize that we can't take it for granted. We need to constantly invest in these processes. But as I mentioned, we're in a phase change. It's incredibly unstable, and we need to reevaluate where we are, hold the line where we can, develop where we can, protect where we must, and then look for those opportunities to move forward when those appear.
And I'm going to come to you, Phil, next. But something you said, Beth, just reminded me of conversations we were having when negotiating questions of justice. And when the ICC was present in northern Uganda and seen as an obstacle to resolving that crisis, we saw ourselves as the David to the ICC's Goliath. I'm wondering who is the David. It looks like the ICC is on a little bit on the ropes and is frankly being bullied by some big powers. Phil, what does it look like? I mean, how do you place this rules-based order? What is the view from the ground? And Beth has already hinted at some of your work at the national level. Could you link those two? Is that where the solutions might be?
It's interesting to me these days to hear proponents of international criminal justice talk about how small and limited and constrained something like the ICC is. But there were many people saying that in 2002. They were saying, look, this is a new institution that's walking into a febrile state-based political system. It has no army, no police force of its own, but it's making these huge claims about what it can do. And many supporters of the court kept telling us that it would do all of these remarkable things. It's maybe taken 20 years for the court itself and many of its supporters to wake up to just how limited the International Criminal Court really can be in this arena. So we got there eventually, but my goodness, it's taken a long time. I think the big problem for me, though, is that in 2002, once the ICC was inaugurated, it then sucked up all of the oxygen out of the field of transitional justice, out of our debates about what accountability could look like, and particularly accountability in the context of very complex situations like peace talks, like DDR processes. You know, what can you actually do in terms of justice in those very difficult situations? Suddenly, the ICC started dictating the terms. Suddenly, every peace process, including the one that you were involved in northern Uganda, Barney, was performed within the confines of the Rome Statute. It was the big game in town. And so I think that the damage that has been done there is that we have missed 20 years of much more systematic discussion and practice around other models of justice, including domestic institutions. What we haven't put enough time and energy into is how do we bolster domestic courts, including in places like Uganda and Ituri in Congo. But also, why has this discussion only become about criminal justice? That's one of the other, I guess, unfortunate gifts of the ICC in the last 20 years, is it has reinforced time and again that criminal justice is the major recourse in the aftermath of mass atrocity. When I think what we're hearing from victims and affected communities right across the world is that justice takes many different forms. It's highly contextual. What it often contains is a socioeconomic component. It often has an aspect of material redress. It often means dealing with inequality and structuring the foundations of society way beyond individual criminalization of these conflicts. So the court, I think, has become the dominant actor in these debates, and we've missed a trick. We haven't spent enough time thinking about other models of justice and redress, and that's one of the big legacies of the creation of this institution.
I mean, I do get your point. Certainly in the earlier days, this idea of it kind of sucked up all the oxygen in the room, and there were huge debates, peace, justice, and how those worked, and it's very real. But what I have seen over the last 20 years is that the system around the court, the Rome Statute system, the way that states have signed up to this, and obviously not every state, but we have in a lot of places now a lot more prosecutions going on. We have a lot, and again, of course, that is saying, yeah, should it be criminal justice? Here am I talking about that again? But we have discussions about mutual legal assistance, how to actually exchange information. We have discussions around how prosecutors can talk to each other from different countries and engage with exchange of witnesses and so on. And there's for me it's as if the ICC it doesn't have to actually be part of those conversations, but the Rome Statute that it is based on has actually initiated a lot of that change in a lot of places that particularly, I would say, out of Latin America and out of Europe, but kind of moving beyond that to places in Asia as well to some degree. And I think also in some places in Africa as well. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe somebody else thinks that that's not what it's done. That's what I see. That it isn't only a sucker up of oxygen; it's also a provider of oxygen to some forms of justice in other parts of the world.
Indeed. And what I hear Phil also saying is that it has, in a sense, moved transitional justice towards a very criminal justice-based practice, and has removed some of the oxygen from other forms of justice and accountability, including the social economic. So maybe this is an opportunity not only to revisit and shore up the ICC, but also to revisit, broader forms of justice other than criminal justice. And that brings us also to the whole question of how does one reinvigorate this Rome Statute system that you're talking about, Janet? Is it something, that can, I hear suddenly from Beth that this is something that can be shored up, that can be repaired. We can weather this period of contraction, but what are some of the ways of doing that? I mean, one of the principles of the Rome Statute, after all, is the principle of complementarity, where the court is seen as the court of last resort, and it's for states to take the initiative. And unless they're either unwilling or unable, then the court wouldn't have a role. Is there a case for revisiting and reinvigorating complementarity, which has not really been very much the fore over the years?
Just going to say briefly, at the last annual meeting of the International Criminal Court, they had, for the first time in so many years, they actually had a debate on some of these issues properly. No, they keep on sort of walking around these issues, but they had the situation where one major state, Italy, had actually let a Libyan suspect go. And they needed to actually address this. It wasn't just, let's say, if nobody minds me saying, more minor state saying, okay, we've got to allow Putin to visit, say Mongolia, letting Putin visit, but a major state who's bought into the system, who, part of, I think, the G7 and so on, they let a Libyan suspect go because of their own state reasons. They needed to debate it. And for me, what was amazing was that this was the first time that the states of the ICC kind of dared to sort of tread on the toes of a fellow state member. But maybe Beth has a different perspective on this.
No, I think you're right. I think when we're talking about critiques of the court, we can make a distinction between those which are essentially within its genetic code. So the Rome Statute itself as a treaty, as Janet said, the court is entirely dependent on state cooperation. So if states are not going to cooperate, it's not going to be able to function. We also can lay some blame at the feet of court actors. So, for example, the stunning prosecutorial overreach of the first prosecutor, focusing on extremely senior figures, making the kinds of claims that Phil has critiqued so brilliantly, and then coupling it with extremely weak investigations. So, and these early decisions of the first prosecutor have really reverberated, and they've created this long tail of a difficulty for the court, with a number of cases being dismissed on motions for acquittal, or not having charges be confirmed, or full-scale acquittals. Obviously, courts will acquit individuals. They should. If they didn't acquit people, we would be concerned that they were completely biased against defendants. But when there's a consistent pattern of failed cases, that indicates something is wrong from the prosecutorial perspective. So I think there's been a recalibration, and some of the more recent investigations that have been opened have been much stronger. They're more present in the communities. They're working more closely with domestic authorities, sharing information. So in some of that, we've seen a course correction. I do think that the situation in Colombia is very instructive here when we're talking about the idea of balancing different forms of justice. And whenever I say the word justice, I really define it quite broadly. It's not just criminal accountability. It's what does it mean to be rehabilitated as a survivor, to be able to tell your story, to create a historical record, to acknowledge abuses, and to have a court condemn those abuses. I think all of those are important. And I think the court, mostly the prosecutor's office, took a much more sophisticated approach to Colombia, working constructively with officials there that were designing their transitional justice response, which is really an ecosystem of restorative justice mechanisms and more retributive justice mechanisms. We might quibble with whether or not they got the ratio right between those two forms of justice, and ultimately it may be the Inter-American Court of Human Rights that will adjudicate this question. But what we're seeing is a very sophisticated response that's trying to respond to the different needs of survivors and the different ways in which justice can be articulated. Truth, reparation, criminal accountability, identifying those who are responsible, but also understanding the causes and consequences of a campaign of violence.
The Colombia case is an important one to talk about, but to contrast it very strongly with the Ugandan case, where we didn't see the ICC give the Ugandan government or the mediation team during the Ugandan peace talks any of the latitude around transitional justice that we've seen in the Colombian case. Now, some would say that's the ICC learning over time. I think there's a deeper reason, which is racism. I think there was a sense within the court, and I think it's a sense that persists. You can't trust African institutions. You can't trust African states. But these more sophisticated, these more legalistic Latin American societies, no problem. Let them work out at the peace talks what justice is going to look like. They'll come up with something really sophisticated like the special jurisdiction for peace, and the ICC says we can live with that. Now, had the same latitude been given to the Ugandan negotiating team in 2006 to 2008, we might have seen a much more comprehensive and a much more responsive form of justice in that peace process. But that latitude, of course, was not given in the Ugandan case. Instead, the mediating team was given this very stark choice, which is you go down the line of prosecutions or your peace process collapses. And certainly that's what we saw. So we've seen a deep problem within the court that I don't think has been resolved up until now, which is what to do with Africa. There's a different set of rules when it comes to dealing with African cases. We've seen much greater skepticism. We haven't seen the same kind of latitude given. Also, to go to Janet's point about cooperation and the catalytic role that the ICC can play, the court has also claimed credit for almost every positive action of any domestic jurisdiction anywhere.
Yes, absolutely.
Including the Colombia case. Colombia is a story of Colombians. What has happened in Colombia is a credit to the Colombian negotiators with the court way in the background. And yet, the court claims through positive complementarity that it's doing wonderful things everywhere. Anytime a domestic jurisdiction does something positive in the criminal justice space, the court says, well, that's only because of us. And I think we just have to be really skeptical of that. There's much more momentum happening in the domestic space in most of the states we're talking about, and much of it has absolutely nothing to do with the ICC.
Well, an example of that was in the Netherlands, where there's been it's not a universal jurisdiction case, but it's a case about trafficking and Eritrea. And the ICC is part of a joint team sharing information. And yes, they came out with their reports to the United Nations, their 6 monthly reports saying, woo, look at us. And, great. Glad that they've been sharing information, but serve the Brits, serve the Italians, so has, lots of other states as well. So I think you have a very valid point there. But, when you're down and out, Phil, you're going to claim, aren't you, that you have done something. You've got to report back to the Security Council. It's scary. Every 6 months, you've got to claim that you've done something. So what do? They, they're dealing with these warlords across Libya, and they're having to try to find something. And in fact, they do have somebody who has been transferred and is in ICC custody for Libya. now. So we will see one of the first Libya cases, I think, starting gradually towards the end of this year.
But do we think that states will come to understand complementarity in the fullness of its original meaning? I remember Luis Moreno Campo in his early, more lucid days when he said that he would be quite happy if he had no cases because states were doing the job. That the court wasn't necessarily there to do cases, but of course the logic, of the standing and status of the court took over, and it feels that it needs to project success. But is there something for states to do in their own appreciation of what complementarity should look like? Should they then therefore cut the court some slack in terms of measuring success?
I don't think there's any question that by virtue of ratifying the Rome Statute, states have then taken it upon themselves to incorporate the Rome Statute crimes into their domestic penal codes. That is a necessary but not sufficient factor for a true kind of complementarity system to work. And so by virtue of now having this in their codes, then they create war crimes units that develop a particular expertise. They join joint investigative teams. They have Eurojust and Europol that they can work through, and other similar arrangements in other regional areas. A few cases move forward. They go forward successfully. That gives other prosecutors a sense that this can actually be done. The fact that we have structural investigations that help understand a large crime base such that individual cases fit within that, it makes it easier to pursue those individual cases. I think it's part of a larger ecosystem. I don't think it's about giving credit here or credit there. It's us moving forward as a human society, incorporating into our domestic and our ways of thinking about the appropriateness of some measure of accountability when atrocities are being committed. And each new case proves that it can be done, provides a measure of inspiration, creates a historical record, creates an evidentiary cache that can be shared through mutual legal assistance arrangements that are strengthening every day. Unfortunately, the transnational criminals are always going to be ahead of the legal authorities. That we see that in the domestic realm as well. But we are gradually building a more robust system. The ICC is not an apex court within that system. It's rather a part of that system that is joining these joint investigative teams, sharing information, bringing a particular level of expertise, but also, I think, in a reciprocal way, learning from the domestic systems as well. And so, when it comes to what do we do, I think we need to be investing in all of these. And then I don't want to lose sight of the hybrid and the regional. We're seeing really interesting and exciting developments at that level, particularly out of the African continent. So we started with the Extraordinary African Chambers for Hissène Habré, Special Criminal Court in the Central African Republic, which is doing cases. Nobody's paying any attention to that court, and it is prosecuting cases. It is successfully bringing survivors in. It is holding people in custody, even while violence is still happening in some of the outer regions of that country. And then now we have this new effort within the Gambia under the ECOWAS umbrella to create a hybrid court at a sub-regional. So all of these levels need to be functional, and we should be, in ways that we can, investing in all of them. But ultimately, I think Phil is exactly right. The national systems need to be the primary engine of justice. And that was always what the vision of complementarity was from the beginning. And we may be finally getting to that point where they're starting to sort of flex those muscles a little bit. It needs to be more expansive, broader regions, not just within Europe, but we're seeing Argentina, South Africa doing some very interesting justice exercises in their national systems. And so the goal now, I think, should be to try and disseminate some of those practices.
Barney, I think there were two categories of crimes that the ICC could have focused on from day one, which would have helped complementarity, but they haven't. One is to show that it's serious about dealing with sitting members of government, senior political and military figures who clearly could not be dealt with through their domestic jurisdictions. And the second one, and Ocampo used to talk about this but never followed through on it, was dealing with the economic and other enablers of conflict who are often transnational actors, arms dealers, banks, financial actors that make conflict possible on the ground. And again, you need an international body with transnational reach to be able to do that. Now, I think it would have aided the cause of complementarity had the court shown that it was serious about two categories of cases that absolutely undeniably domestic actors couldn't deal with. And they vacated that space, either going after completely ludicrous senior cases like Bashir, which they were never going to do, and avoiding the transnational cases altogether. And instead, what we saw was the court, and I've written about this in my book, Distant Justice, was to steal domestic cases like the Ituri ones in Congo that were already being dealt with by the domestic system. In the cases of Lubanga, Katanga, and Ngujolo, we had domestic investigations which were already underway. And through all sorts of political machinations between Kabila's government and the Hague, these cases were snatched from under the noses of the Ituri courts and taken to the Hague. So there was no need for the ICC in that space, that the Congolese judiciary was already dealing with them. So complementarity would have been aided by the court being really serious about it. It said, this is one of our guiding principles. It needed to live up to that. Allow domestic institutions to go ahead with cases they were already dealing with and get on with the job of dealing with the cases that national institutions would actually be unable to do. And we didn't see either of those things really right up until the present.
Well, I agree that this discussion of complementarity is really important for us to understand, what the court has done, what it can do, and what is needed now for us to support these other institutions that Beth has mentioned. I feel there is another level on which we need to discuss the court, which is what states think that this court is actually for. There is I think it's a relatively small number of states who actually think that justice is a good in itself, and it is important to support this court through thick and thin. I think a lot of the other states that have signed up for the court actually think, what is this court good for me for? Does it, as you saw in terms of the referrals from Africa, even the ones that Phil was referencing, can it help me put some of my opponents in jail? Can it be useful in a bigger conflict that I have a particular point of view on, let's say Israel-Palestine or Ukraine-Russia? And the court is very often being instrumentalized by the states. And I think that this is always going to be a big problem for them. I want to throw that to Beth as a former representative of the state. I know you're not anymore, but did you have that sense in the debates that you were part of in state when you were an ambassador for the United States? Sort of, there was always this consideration of what's in it for us.
I think there's no question we can look at the practice of the court. And I always want to be careful when I say the court, because there are different actors. So some of the things that Phil is criticizing are actually in the hands of the prosecutor, right? Making certain decisions when to pursue cases, when to not. Some of it is in the hands of the court, right? If there's a complementarity challenge, how do they rule on that challenge? Do they maintain and seize jurisdiction, or do they concede jurisdiction to the national system? So, let's try and bring some rigor to the conversation when we're engaging in these types of critiques. I think if you look at the practice of sort of which cases have gone forward and which haven't, it's very easy to conclude that this is about selective justice. Mm-hmm. This is about non-state actors, that this is about states instrumentalizing the court in order to marginalize or neutralize an internal opponent. There's definitely, that is very valid perspective. We can also, however, look at it the perspective as an incremental exercise in building a justice system. And you always start with easier cases. Prosecutors should be starting with lower level defendants and then moving up a chain of command, establishing precedent, establishing the practice, learning how to do these cases in terms of witness protection and evidentiary challenges and all of that, and gradually building a more robust system that we can then trust moving forward. So I think some of the cases that are proceeding now, Duterte will be quite interesting, right? Very senior figure, arguably instrumentalized by the current of power within the Philippines, but nonetheless, a really bad dude who should be prosecuted for creating a system of summary execution that he essentially has articulated pride in having established. And so, that case should go forward. Mm-hmm. So yes, we can look at it from the perspective of cynicism, but we can also look at it from the perspective of, here's an opportunity to articulate a vision of justice that says this is absolutely beyond the pale to establish a system like this of social cleansing within your society, that where you have individuals being summarily executed on the street, their bodies dumped on the side of the road. That's not okay. And we need an institution that can say that definitively. Would it have been better for the Philippines court to do that, yes, but politically it wasn't possible for them to do it internally. They've obviously made that determination. And so this is convenient, but also it's a case that needs to go forward. And so will, I hope, create an important precedent that will send a message to others that might think in the back of their head, maybe I won't engage in this exercise in summary execution because look what happened to Duterte eventually.
Well, looking ahead, therefore, taking into account all that we've said, and including Phil's point about economic crimes of a transnational nature, which we're seeing as major drivers of conflict, certainly in the Great Lakes, Sudan, South Sudan. What kind of international justice are each of you hoping for, given the crisis that the world is facing and all of these needs for accountability?
Well, I'm glad you liked our variety of ways of saying, they've got to do it better, Barney. But let push it over to my colleagues, to Beth and Phil. Do you have a kind of an ideal vision? I think Beth's is very much about the whole system. Maybe Phil's is more about, what the ICC should do on the ground. But if you were reconstructing it from start, what would you do?
I'd make it smaller. I'd make it quieter. I'd make it humbler. I'd put it back alongside all of the other possible transitional justice mechanisms we can imagine, and it would be one of many. But I think it was difficult that the ICC was created in this blaze of glory in 2002. These elevated narratives of the culmination of history from Nuremberg and through until the present. And it almost guaranteed that we were going to end up with a very loud, brash interventionist court. And I think we've, in some respects, got to go back to the first love of the institution, which was to say, let's get serious about complementarity. Let's use that as the touchstone. And I think if we look at the statute, the wording is pretty clear. Complementarity says the court should be a backstop. It should be a subsidiary organization. We need to get back to that. I think we have to change our whole orientation. We have to realize that justice is not just about criminal justice. So that opens up a whole spread of possibilities. And the emphasis has to go back to the domestic. Partly, too, that's a message to donors. A lot of this is about money. It's about funding. Well, a huge amount of money has been spent on the ICC, and we've gotten what we've gotten. It's not going to get much better than this. It is what it is. It's very limited. It can't do very much. Put your money somewhere else. Try it. Try funding in a very serious way domestic institutions in places that the international community hasn't worked in before, and see what happens. We haven't given that model a go. We dismissed it out of hand in 2002. So I think that's the change. It's a full reorientation of the transitional justice space, and the ICC becomes a very tiny player in all of that.
And I'm very invested in the hybrid and hybridity and thinking about what work that can do to strengthen domestic systems. It brings a measure of legitimacy from kind of two different perspectives. Many survivors and victims are actually quite distrustful of their national justice systems because they have let them down over the years. They've allowed impunity to become entrenched. And so adding some international involvement can sometimes bring a measure of legitimacy domestically, while at the same time having the domestic counterparts working side by side with their international colleagues brings a measure of local legitimacy. They understand the system, the players, the dynamics of violence, what the political milieu is in which these efforts are trying to proceed. And so it's a better institution by virtue of having these injections from the international and then from the very local. I saw this relatively recently in Sierra Leone. They had a legacy conference for the Special Court for Sierra Leone. Mm-hmm. And it was remarkable to hear from our Sierra Leonean colleagues about all of the investments that they attributed in part to the Special Court for Sierra Leone being there and being embedded in their national system. So everything from legal reforms to fair trial guarantees to having various forms of sexual violence be codified within their national code, to the fact that individuals who were interns at the Special Court for Sierra Leone are now occupying positions in the highest realms of the Ministry of Justice. I mean, literally the Deputy Minister of Justice. And so seeing these inputs and how the local experts and jurists really felt like that exercise in hybrid justice was incredibly important in terms of instantiating the ordinary rule of law within Sierra Leone. And so I think, focusing on the local, getting donors to be willing to invest there and do the hard, bespoke work that it takes to understand who can be trusted with funding, who is legitimate, who actually does speak for survivors, and then at the same time looking for ways to hybridize some of these processes. And then you can gradually remove the international element, as we saw in Bosnia and elsewhere, once the system can stand on its own 2 feet and really deliver justice in a way that's fair but also robust.
And hearing you, Beth, I think I would also make the ICC a partially hybrid court. And why they're sitting in The Hague? Why doesn't a chamber move to somewhere in Central
Absolutely.
Africa? You could have a single judge from the ICC and incorporating national judges and to deal with some of the cases, leave behind some expertise as well for the national systems, and then really get to understand the dynamics on the ground and the different visions of justice from real interactions with the stakeholders.
Well, and the Rome Statute envisions those sorts of in situ proceedings. And there were some efforts to do that. And it was, I think, quite frustrating for many of us court watchers to see the judges in particular being resistant to sitting in situ. They don't want to leave The Hague. It's comfortable, right?
Yeah.
And the fact that they could have delivered justice more locally and allowed it to be seen and not just seen on a screen, but actually have people come through. I mean, the Cambodia Tribunal, the Extraordinary Chamber, is deeply problematic on a whole range of issues. But one thing they did right, and it was actually driven by civil society, was they had hundreds of Cambodians came through and watched those proceedings, and then had focus groups and discussion groups, and there were films and plays, all of this stuff on the margins of the ECCC. But that's where the ideas around justice were really being delivered and explored and debated amongst the Cambodian society. And so being able to do that with the ICC, I think, would be incredibly beneficial. But so far, proposals to do that have not been received warmly.
Instead of which, I mean, it's become a bureaucracy, and it has an institutional instinct to defend itself all the time. Legitimately, of course, it needs to defend itself, but it makes it very difficult, I think, for the kind of imagination that we would all like to have as to how it could do something different actually to happen in reality at the moment, particularly while it is absolutely under siege with these sanctions. The sword of Damocles hangs over the International Criminal Court. It puts a foot wrong, and there will be sanctions on the court as a whole from Washington, and that would mean that the institution would find it very, very difficult to operate at all. So, I'd also say be careful, everybody, what you wish for in terms of dead man walking. Do you really want this to turn into a dead man? Or would we like to see it kind of gradually stumble along a little bit and maybe become fitter again in the future? Barney, just before we wrap up, you've heard from all 3 of us our kind of different critiques, and I think you've agreed with a lot of what we've had to say. But do you think that the ICC is an example of a dead man walking institution now? Is it on the way out, or do you think it can actually be play a useful role in the world of justice and accountability?
I think from what each of you has said, it's important that international justice is responsive to the local level and helps the decentralization of the idea of justice. It's not feasible to have a single institution carrying the weight and burden of justice. It's got to be decentralized, and visions of justice must resonate, particularly with affected communities. Indeed, a decentralized system, and one that is sensitive and understands and is also equal to the sophistication of the views of justice that we hear from below. And therefore, many thanks to you, Beth, Janet, Phil, for a really invigorating discussion. And of course, to our listeners, thank you for joining us. And we invite you to subscribe, share the news of the podcast. Join us for the next episode of Dead Men Walking, where we will discuss the future of other 20th century global institutions and norms for peace, democracy, and human rights. None of the answers are easy, but we look forward to those discussions. I'm Barney Afako, and you are listening to Dead Men Walking, Conversations on Global Norms and Institutions, a podcast series by the Institute for Integrated Transitions, produced in collaboration with justiceinfo.net.
Dead Men Walking.